Three great presenters and three papers on this panel, and we're really looking forward to hearing also your thoughts and questions and discussion afterwards. So there will be time afterwards to do that. I think the plan is for me to introduce all of the panelists, all of the speakers today, and then they will go in the order that's in the program. So I'll do all the introductions first, and then they'll present in that order. So our first first presenter is Constantine Gidaris. Constantine is an MA student in the English and Cultural Studies Department at McMaster University here. He holds an honors BA and a Bachelor of Education from the University of Toronto, and his current research interests include cultural studies, media and film studies, terrorism, politics, and race. I'm also going to provide a very brief, kind of general description of their paper. So this is a condensed version of their abstracts. His paper, Precrime and Preemption, the Minority Report and Bill C-51, draws on the parallels between Philip K. Dick's short story, The Minority Report, and the legal text, Bill C-51, to highlight the dangers associated with the bill's expansion of police powers, its erosion of fundamental justice, and its encroachment on the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Our second presenter is Maya Seshia. Maya is a PhD candidate at the University of Alberta. Much of her research examines processes of racism and colonialism in Canada and how such processes impact the valuing of lives. Maya's dissertation explores what the Canadian government and public's responses to the Air India disaster reveal about Canadian citizenship and the conceptions of the Canadian nation. So Maya's paper is titled A Critical Examination of Governmental and Public Responses to the Bombing of Air India Flight 182. This paper explores what the Canadian government and public's responses to the Air India disaster reveal about articulations of race, Canadian citizenship, and conceptions of the nation. Some of her queries include, why was the Air India terrorist attack not initially perceived as a Canadian tragedy involving Canadian citizens? How has it come to be perceived as a Canadian tragedy? How does the articulations of race, citizenship, and the Canadian nation shift over the development of the Air India story? And our last presenter is Milan Singh. Milan recently completed her PhD in the School of Communication at Fraser University. Her SSHRC-funded doctoral project focuses on the Canadian government's commission of inquiry into the bombing of Air India Flight 182. Using public testimony, legal and government documents, and media reports, her research examines the complexities surrounding Canadian citizenship. Her research interests include the political activity of the Canadian South Asian diaspora, the Komagata Maru incident, and media representations of marginalized groups. She is currently a research fellow with the Center for Policy Studies on Culture and Communication at Simon Fraser. So her paper is titled Acts of Citizenship, a critique of the Air India inquiry. It argues that the testimonies of Air India victims' families can be used as evidence to challenge conventional definitions of citizenship. She suggests that normative parameters of citizenship erase the severity of the families' demands, ignoring their ongoing struggles for information, services, and justice for the Canadian government for over 20 years. She argues instead that discourses of citizenship need to consider the agency of subjects and the challenges they face. So these are our three presenters, and Constantine will start.
Okay. So can you hear me back there? Am I okay? Okay. Thanks for coming. The title of my presentation is called Precrime and Preemption, the Minority Report in Bill C-51. This paper aims to briefly explore some of the legal implications in Bill C-51, the Anti-Terrorism Act, but in doing so it aims to offer more of a cultural analysis of those implications rather than necessarily a legal one. I hope to examine the ways in which the bill contributes to dominant discourses of terrorism, discourses that have made terrorism in many ways synonymous with Islam. In an attempt to legitimize the 2006 terror sweeps of Canadians with brown skin, Middle Eastern looks, beards, and Muslim or Arab names, and to justify the past and current heightened state of surveillance of racialized Canadians, dominant discourses of terrorism often prescribe to racial profiling by using what Shireen Razak describes as race as a proxy for risk. I intend to use Philip K. Dick's short story, The Minority Report, as a way of initiating a process that calls into question the precarious preemptive powers authorized by Bill C-51. Although the legislation poses a threat to the rights and freedoms of all Canadians, I intend to argue that it poses a significantly higher threat to the rights and freedoms of Muslim and Arab Canadians. Published in 1956, the Minority Report tells the story of a police force that uses the theory of pre-crime as crime prevention, a methodology that relies on arresting individuals before they commit any crimes. That is to say, if they commit any crimes. The ethical and legal drawback to such a methodology is rather obvious. The arrested individuals are never criminals at the time of their arrest or at any time thereafter. John Anderton, the protagonist and police commissioner in the short story, acknowledges the illegality of pre-crime since they arrest individuals, quote, before they can commit an act of violence. So the commission of the crime itself is absolute metaphysics. The absurdity of such a program is compounded by the way in which it produces its list of potential suspects. 3 unconscious precognition mutants, who Dick refers to as vegetable-like babbling idiots with no spiritual needs, have every incoherent utterance analyzed by the machinery they are bound to, and produce the names of the potential suspects and their victims onto conventional punch cards, which the police force then uses to make their preemptive arrests. A philosophical difference between this pre-crime program and the one established in Bill C-51 is that pre-crime maintains a distinction between precognitive powers, powers reserved for the 3 mutants, and legal powers, powers reserved for law enforcement. Bill C-51, on the other hand, fuses precognitive and legal powers, and dangerously bestows both sets of powers onto its security and law enforcement officials, blurring a relevant distinction between the two. Canada's legitimate concern with preventing terrorism has crossed into illegitimate territory by legalizing the arrests of Canadians merely suspected of participating in terrorist activity. In Part 3 of Bill C-51, under revisions to the Criminal Code in Section 17, peace officers are given the power to arrest individuals based on reasonable grounds that a terrorist activity may be carried out. Under the same section of law, peace officers are also given the power to arrest individuals on reasonable grounds that their arrest is likely to prevent the carrying out of a terrorist activity. This is a substantial shift away from the previous laws established in the Criminal Code, which, as the Canadian Bar Association points out, substitutes a requirement of a reasonable belief that terrorist activity will be carried out with a reasonable belief that terrorist activity may be carried out. The revisions also substitute the requirement that the arrest of a person is necessary to prevent the terrorist activity with is likely to prevent the terrorist activity. The shift away from reasonable grounds regulated by standards of certainty to reasonable grounds regulated by standards of uncertainty creates a legal imbalance that safeguards the state and its security and law enforcement agencies against measures previously deemed to be illegal. Although such measures make all Canadian citizens vulnerable to suspicion of terrorist activity under Bill C-51, we must acknowledge what Chief Justice Dennis O'Connor stated in his 2006 report as the Commissioner of the Montreal Inquiry, and that is, I quote, "Anti-terrorism investigations at present focus largely on members of Muslim and Arab communities. There is therefore an increased risk of racial, religious, or ethnic profiling in the sense that the race, religion, or ethnicity of individuals may expose them to investigation." So if anti-terrorism investigations target Muslim and Arab communities, as Chief Justice Dennis O'Connor states, what do we make of a legal document that calls itself the Anti-Terrorism Act? Who is being targeted by this piece of legislation? What do we make of 6-year-old Saeed Adam Ahmed, who found himself on Canada's deemed high-profile list of potential threats to public safety while attempting to fly from Toronto to Montreal to watch a hockey game with his father? What do we make of Muslim community leaders who report that agents from CSIS, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, have on occasion forced Muslim refugee claimants to spy within their communities in order to be granted the right to stay in Canada? We need to begin a process of reversing the perpetuated association between terrorism and Islam, one that fuels policymaking based on racial, religious, and ethnic profiling, where adjectives such as Muslim and Islamic often precede nouns such as extremism and fundamentalism. Kareem H. Kareem notes that the inundation of news headlines such as Islam versus the West in Newsweek or the Sword of Islam in Time trigger the reader or viewer to activate dominant cognitive models about Islamic terrorism, models that implicate the Islamic faith in acts of violence. Religious fundamentalists with loose ties to Islam are commonly labeled by mainstream media as Muslim extremists or Islamic fundamentalists, whereas violent groups with loose ties to Christianity, such as the Ku Klux Klan or the Branch Davidians, are labeled respectively as right-wing extremists or cults, but not as Christian fundamentalists or Christian extremists. The mainstream media seems to reconfigure the representation of Islam in a similar way that ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, does, and that is by exploiting and corrupting the adjective Islamic. When ISIS strikes, as they recently did in Paris and Belgium, for example, they strike quite literally in the name of Islam since the adjective Islamic is interpolated in the name of a terrorist organization. When they claim responsibility for their terrorist act, it is not they who bear the brunt of the social and cultural ramifications of their violent actions, but the vast majority of non-violent Muslims instead. We know that following the attacks, Muslims across Canada, and more specifically, Muslims across Canada were targeted in violent attacks, and more specifically, attacks targeted Muslim women wearing the hijab. The media, much like ISIS, worked to implicate the majority of Muslims into dominant discourses of terrorism because of the actions of a few. According to the 2014 public report on the terrorist threat to Canada, terrorist threats emanate solely from Islamic countries such as Iran, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Tunisia, and Egypt, just to name a few. Since the report isolates Islamic countries as the sole producers of terror threats to Canada, it in a way pardons the non-Islamic producers of terrorism who may or may not pose terror threats to Canada, and capitulates the dominant discourses of terrorism that undermine any notion of racial neutrality. The report also commits a critical error by identifying these countries according to their dominant religion, a practice that reduces the political relevancy of these countries to singular matters of religion, and one that consequently frames these countries within dominant discourses of Islamic fundamentalism while neglecting the complexity of their histories and politics as individual states, shaped and influenced in some cases by Western imperialism. The anti and the anti-terrorism legislation is therefore not in opposition to all forms of terrorism or potential terrorism, but rather one that focuses on subjugating refugees, immigrants, and Canadian citizens of Islamic origins to higher levels of suspicion, surveillance, and investigation, not because they necessarily pose a higher security risk to Canada, but because they pose a threat to Canada's survival as a white nation state. In an unstable political climate driven by a misrepresentation and falsification of Islam, Muslim and Arab Canadians are excluded from Canada's national identity because they are part of what Sunera Tabani calls the non-preferred race. They are seen as unwelcome intruders whose, quote, lack of Christian faith, inherent deviant tendencies, and unchecked fecundity threaten Canada's survival as a white and traditionally Christian nation state. The social and cultural inclination to treat the Muslim male in particular as a potential threat and enemy to the nation state has intensified the post-9/11 fear of the other. We must ask ourselves whose arrest in Canada is more likely to prevent the carrying of a terrorist activity than that of a Muslim male, especially if that male refuses the westernization of his mind and body. And then ask ourselves, why is that the case? Razak writes that race is crucial to preemptive punishment. It's a colonial logic preserved by the nation state, and one that makes the absurdity of the pre-crime program in the Minority Report seem like a more viable option than Bill C-51. We know for certain that both preemptive programs devalue and compromise any semblance of freedom of will. What may happen in the future, what is likely to happen in the future, becomes what will happen in the future. The potential actions of suspected individuals, actions that have not occurred and may in fact never occur, are rendered culpable and terminable. Bill C-51, like pre-crime, nullifies the presumption of innocence of the accused because it criminalizes possibility and potentiality. Future actions, regardless of outcome, are determined by laws rather than time and reality, and are thus subjected to its consequences and punishments. Despite the similarities between Bill C-51 and Dick's pre-crime program, there is a distinct cultural difference between the two. The former is embroiled in dominant discourses of terrorism and discrimination, whereas the latter operates independently of them. Those who perceive the future in the Minority Report are unconscious, alive but not living in a culture influenced by any dominant discourses. Their accusations lack deliberate racial, religious, or ethnic prejudice. The same cannot be said, however, about the preemptive measures in Bill C-51, which equips subjective and biased peace officers influenced by dominant discourses as much as anyone else with the power to intervene, interrogate, and arrest those they deem as potential security threats to Canada. And although peace officers are required to use reasonable grounds prior to making their arrests, a legal requirement that's supposed to transcend suspicion and possibility, what is reasonable about reasonable grounds in a bill that uses reasonable grounds to predict future actions? The reasonable grounds under these circumstances not lack a certain degree of reasonability, reliability, and objectivity. Or how reasonable are the minister's reasonable grounds, who, for example, under Part 2, Section 8 of the bill, can establish a list of names of suspects he thinks or deems he believes will engage or attempt to engage in an act that would threaten transportation security. Are we to reasonably assume then that 6-year-old Saeed Adam Ahmed, whom I mentioned earlier, 21-month-old Sebastian Khan, or 10-week-old Nasir Muhammad Ali, Canadian children on Canada's no-fly list, will engage or attempt to engage in an act that would threaten transportation security? Perhaps the more reasonable explanation is not that any of these children are actual threats to Canada's security, but that they are identified as such by virtue of their Islamic names. That is indicative of an institutionalized extremism that discriminates not only against non-preferred bodies, religions, and ethnicities, but one that discriminates against the way in which letters are arranged on screens and paper, and the cultural threat those arrangements of letters may pose to the state and nation state. One last concern I'll raise about Bill C-51, and there are many, is its capacity to destabilize the juridical process. Its preemptive laws are used to foresee unforeseeable futures and render those futures to punishments in the present before they can manifest themselves in the future. In a way, Canadian security and law enforcement agencies take the place of the precognition used in the Minority Report and go one step further by contributing to the dominant discourses that obfuscate the distinction between terrorism and Islam. As recently as last month, the RCMP preemptively arrested Kadir Abdul and Samuel Augustin Aviles after the Canadians were detained by Turkish authorities. The RCMP believe they have reasonable grounds to suspect that Canadians, quote, may participate in an activity of a terrorist group, travel to participate in an activity of a terrorist group, or facilitate terrorist activity. Yet despite the RCMP's reasonable grounds, the two men were released free of any criminal charges. Under ordinary legal proceedings, insufficient evidence paves the way to innocence, but Bill C-51 makes the ordinary extraordinary. The defendants Abdul and Aviles were released on recognizances, also known as peace bonds, conditions that impart a degree of guilt because recognizances can be refused by the defendants as a way of proclaiming and maintaining innocence. Except the refusal of a recognizance under Part 3, Section 25 of the bill authorizes the provincial court judge to commit the defendants to prison for a term not exceeding 12 months. So rather than look at the recognizance as an indicator of guilt and complicity in cases of suspected terrorism, we should look at the recognizance as a choice between the lesser of two evils, one that allows defendants to avoid the possibility of imprisonment, but more importantly, to avoid imprisonment without a trial. That's not to say that all preemptive measures should be abandoned or outlawed. We know that Article 51 of the Charter of the United Nations, for example, allows states to take preemptive action as self-defense if an armed attack occurs against a member of the UN. The preemptive measure in this case is reactive rather than blindly proactive. In other words, it's a self-defense measure against attacks where the attacker is known rather than suspected. What I'm urging for in this paper is not an eradication of all preemptive security measures. Rather, I'm calling for security measures that resist the temptation to submit to a seeming re-emergence of McCarthyism, where accusations of individuals based on assumptions and a lack of evidence are encoded in law. Accusations that, for the most part, incriminate racialized communities, particularly those of Islamic and Arabic ancestry. Thank you.
Thanks, Constantine. Our next presenter is Maya.
Do you think you can tell me every 5 minutes?
Every 5 minutes?
Would that be okay?
Okay, so do you want me to just say 5-minute mark? 5 minutes?
Okay, whatever works.
I can just send you a note.
Yes, perfect, great. I just want to make sure I run on time.
Yeah.
First of all, can everyone hear me or? Okay, great, just let me know if you can't. Good morning, my name is Maya Seshia. I'd like to thank you all for coming to the panel. I'd like to especially thank the organizers and my fellow presenters, chair, and of course victims' families for coming out to this conference and attending the panel. I'd first like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous territories in which we're on today. I think this is, as Amber Dean pointed out, an essential component of understanding our nation, understanding Canada, and understanding Air India itself. At first glance, Air India and colonialism might not seem related, but as Amber Dean remarked yesterday, they are fundamentally connected. Both raise critical questions about racism, whiteness, citizenship, territory, national belonging, and processes of inclusion and exclusion. More importantly, both raise crucial questions about how these factors relate to the degree in which we value different lives. In this vein, I think it's important to ask critical questions and think about how past and present day colonialism in Canada relates to Air India. So this presentation is essentially a quick summary of some key points in my dissertation. I track different shifts and continuities in articulations of nation, citizenship, and race in respect to Air India. One of my key arguments is that despite the recent embracement of Air India as Canadian, the racist processes shaping the Canadian government and dominant public's initial responses to Air India continue to persist. I think while this renationalization is certainly significant in some ways, we also need to think critically about it. Specifically, often articulations of Canadianness are based on a decontextualization and disconnect from the racism that casts Air India out of the nation. Methodologically, I draw on House of Commons debates, a variety of newspaper reports, government reports, and I'm in the process of gathering counter-narratives from community newspapers. As mentioned, and Amberdean again stated this yesterday, to begin, I'd like to emphasize the importance of historically contextualizing Air India. Examining the connections between Air India and the historical casting out of Indian migrants and their settlement in Canada reveals much about the Canadian nation, much about processes of inclusion and exclusion, and much about how Canada in itself is a racial colonial state. The key points I want to make is historically contextualizing Air India makes even more apparent the fact that Canada is a racial colonial entity whose very foundation and creation is premised on colonial violence. Secondly, historical contextualization reveals that the racism that cast Air India outside the nation has a long history dating back again to the formation of the nation and the state. And finally, membership in Canada has historically been equated to whiteness, and we see this play out in Air India. Looking at the 1985 to 1990 period, there's a few key points I'd like to make, and then I'll probably spend the majority of the discussion talking about the 1990 to 2000 period, because it's a decade that's not really talked about much. Despite the implementation of Canada's multiculturalism policy and the supposed liberalization of Canadian citizenship via the point system, the period of 1985 to 1990, specifically the pre- and immediate post-bombing period, and the reactions of the Canadian state and nation illustrate that the systemic racism embedded in Canadians' institutions, culture, and in Canada remained in place. It is increasingly, though not entirely, recognized that Air India was initially cast outside the nation. An analysis of House of Commons discourses reveals this. Victims and victims' families are positioned as internal foreigners, described by Yasmin Abulaban and Rita Damone as subjects who hold legal Canadian citizenship status and reside within the nation, but are read as outside foreigners and non-Canadians. Despite holding Canadian citizenship, suspects were also configured as dangerous internal foreigners. They were read as non-Canadians as well. During this period, Air India itself was configured as a conflict resulting from a foreign issue, a foreign conflict in India that had no connection whatsoever in Canada. The construction of Air India as a foreign tragedy involving foreign victims and suspects is illustrated by Mulroney's call to offer condolences to the government of India, the total lack of support, as so many people have emphasized, offered to victims' families, the total lack of communication by the Canadian government to families, and the general lack of mourning over Air India. Now, looking at the 1990 to 2000 period, here, at first I thought articulations of Canadianness, the embrace of Canadianness, became much more apparent in the post-9/11 period. And although I still think this is the case, a review of the 1990 to 2000 period, a review of House of Commons debates, reveals that actually expressions of Canadianness began to appear in this decade. My key point here I want to make is that the late 1800 and early 1900 equation of Canadian citizenship and membership in the Canadian nation to whiteness, that is, who is a Canadian citizen, remained intact. So in the 1990 to 2000 period, government officials began to renationalize Air India as Canadian. They did so specifically to argue in favor of a royal commission. Yet, despite this renationalization and seeming support for a royal commission by some people in the House of Commons, the key officials in the Canadian government persistently rejected their calls. Within the House of Commons, increasing support for a royal commission is expressed by a variety of MPs. In addition, as mentioned, Air India is nationalized as Canadian. MPs increasingly characterize Air India as, quote, the worst mass murder in Canadian history. Victims are increasingly described as Canadian citizens. My argument is, whilst the characterizations of Air India as Canadian symbolize a shift and can be read as progress, and maybe possibly used strategically to argue for a royal commission, I think we also need to think critically about the effects, both positive and negative, of this nationalizing discourse. So what are the consequences? What happens when Air India is decontextualized from the racial politics governing immediate pre- and post-bombing reactions, and is disconnected from questions about why Air India was interpreted as a foreign event involving foreign citizens in the first place? When detextualized from the racist politics governing the state and dominant nations' reaction, this renationalization and reinvention of Air India ultimately obscures the systemic racism that shaped the state and nation's reaction to Air India. As such, Air India is reinvented as always being a national catastrophe, and the fact that the state and dominant nation cast it outside the nation is obscured. Now, despite this increasing support for a royal commission and increasing nationalization of Air India, a royal commission is ultimately rejected by key government officials. This rejection is premised on the notion that the investigation is ongoing and progressing, and undertaking one would conflict with the criminal investigation. At times, this rejection was expressed with disbelief and hostility. Hostility at the suggestion Canada has a responsibility to undertake a royal commission. One example is in 1996, when asked whether the Liberal government will hold an inquiry into Air India, then Prime Minister Jean Chrétien responded by saying, quote, if no inquiry has been called in the last 10 years, the chances are there will be an inquiry called at this very moment are not very big. He elaborated by stating that some crimes do not get solved. If the RCMP has been unable to find answers, then a royal commission is unlikely to, and it would not be logical to spend money on such an undertaking. When R. Paul Dillon, a writer for the Indo-Canadian Vancouver newspaper, The Link, remarked that victims' families want answers, the Prime Minister snapped, quote, I just gave you an answer. You might not be happy with it, end quote. Now, I argue through these insistences that the investigation is progressing and ongoing, and undertaking a royal commission would hinder the criminal prosecution of suspects, the state constructs itself as responsible, taking a responsible decision not to hold a royal commission. Yet, through the rejection of a royal commission, the state says we are also not responsible for Air India, and it avoids accountability. Sarah Ahmed's assertion that state rejections constitute a political action that ultimately configure events, suspects, and the nation and state. Her observation about this, that rejection constitutes things, can be applied to rejections of a royal commission. In some ways, rejecting a royal commission forecloses, as Sarah Ahmed points out, responsibility, and it has consequences in the sense that it cuts off the speaker and the nation from the histories that shape the present and the past. Like all forms of rejection, this action of rejection is productive. It reinvents the Canadian nation-state as innocent, and it helps maintain the racial borders of who substantially is a Canadian. Finally, the 2001 to present period. In this period, I argue that Air India is increasingly characterized as a Canadian terrorist attack, and victims continue to be increasingly embraced as Canadian. Victims are increasingly labeled as Canadian. Air India is configured from a crash and tragedy to the largest mass murder in Canadian history to even more so a Canadian terrorist attack. This increase and continued recognition that Air India is a Canadian terrorist attack is significant. This shift is linked surely to the decades of activism by victims' families and their supporters. Yet, while certainly significant, the systemic racism influencing the pre- and post-bombing response and the nation's mourning, or lack thereof, continues to be denied in this decade. One example is Commissioner Chair Major's remarks in the Royal Commission in the 2010 report. He states that, quote, "The Commission finds that the term racism is not helpful for the purposes of understanding the government's response. Racism carries with it so many connotations of bigotry and intolerance that even the most careful definition that purports to focus on efforts rather than on intents ends up generating a great deal of heat than light," end quote. And the denial of racism is also apparent in the Phase 1 report and the Ray report, which I argue is based on a colorblind lens that ultimately obscures the role racism played in Air India. So to conclude, the key points are we must historically contextualize Air India, and to address systemic inequalities, they first must be named and then widely recognized and acknowledged. The continued denial of the role racism has played throughout the Air India case and the colorblind lens adopted by the Government of Canada and the Air India inquiry raise the question, has the story of Air India shifted over time, or is the dominant narrative very much the same as the one told in the years immediately following the 1985 bombings? Some concluding questions that remain unanswered is, how can we imagine substantial consideration of the role played in Air India? What change is required to take this into account? Does Air India defy borders, territory, and national belonging? And finally, how does Air India relate to colonialism in Canada and violence against Indigenous people? How can we understand both in relation to one another?
Your mic is working.
Oh, is it? Because I don't think I can project, so I'm gonna.
I wasn't sure.
Our next presenter is Milan Singh. Perfect. I think the mic will help me a little bit here. Can you hear me in the back? Awesome. So in following my co-presenter, Maya Seshia, I'd like to recognize the territories of the Clovis and the Iroquois people on which this conference is happening. I'd also like to recognize the territories of the Coast Salish peoples in which I live and work, because in talking about citizenship and in talking about Air India, the intersections with Indigenous peoples are very strong and need to be acknowledged throughout the process. And so I thank Maya for doing that, and I am lucky to be able to continue on in that recognition. My paper today is on citizenship as well, and I think it's quite fitting that we're speaking together. So as we opened up the conference yesterday, we'd have to see that as we know, that Canadian authorities did not initially see Air India Flight 182 as a Canadian concern. They failed to effectively investigate the bombings and provide families of victims with adequate support for the traumatic losses they underwent. This is despite families repeatedly demanding the Canadian government for information, services, and a thorough criminal investigation. In 2006, after 2 decades of lobbying the Canadian government, demands for a public inquiry were met. However, the inquiry began the inquiry began with victims' families' testimonies, which were meant to help understand the human element of the tragedy. Family members strongly critiqued the government's actions over the last 2 decades and stated that they were racially discriminated against. Yet the final Air India inquiry report denies that racism was ever a factor, as Maya just read and pointed out for us. So my focus of this presentation then examines the demands of family members, their agency, and their actions. I critically examine their testimonies as one version of their experience, knowing that at the public inquiry and in that setting, they spoke in a particular way, and recognizing that their stories have been retold and told in multiple ways, so not privileging necessarily this one experience over the others. So I critically examine their testimonies as a way to challenge conventional definitions of citizenship. I suggest that normative parameters of citizenship then erase the severity of the family's demands, ignoring their ongoing struggles for information, services, and justice from the Canadian government. I argue that within their testimonies then lie embedded statements about the actions that they took, and both the tangible and intangible ways that they could have been supported. We need to look at both the tangible and intangible ways to help us redefine and understand the ways we can start looking at citizenship moving forward. So I argue that families, by linking their demands and their rights to their citizenship, and also articulating themselves as Canadian citizens, allows for a reconceptualization of how we understand these sets of rights. To make this argument, I draw on the concept of acts of citizenship by Engin Eisen. For Eisen, an act of citizenship is not about classifying actions in the abstract, but about investigating the grounds on which they involve claims or demands and their consequences of those demands and claims as well. He argues that new subjects, sites, and scales of struggle, he argues that through new subjects, sites, and scales, citizenship, while typically understood as a legal status of membership in the state, if not the nation state, becomes increasingly defined as practice of becoming claim-making subjects. And this is the part that I really hold on to, is the way that family members act as claim-making subjects. This framework helps me examine, then, how the concept of citizenship can be reconceptualized, and how it can be understood through the actions subjects take in their pursuit of justice, and not through categories of immigration status, of visa, of ethnicity, of settlement. It allows me then to actively show that identities are fluid, that they're influenced by historical and the political context in which they are situated. This framework also allows me to consider the ways in which families engaged with their citizenship and the diversity in how they engaged with that concept, defining it through their claims for rights and through their actions versus the label of citizenship that is imposed upon one. While my larger research project looks at multiple sites to re-narrate the bombings from the families' voices as a way to counter or provide an alternative narrative to the government articulations. For the purpose of this paper and to illustrate my argument, I'm only going to go through quotes of families' testimonies at 3 particular sites. I'll conclude then with an analysis of how their actions can be looked at to redefine citizenship. So site 1. Hearing about Flight 182. So within this site, or as how I articulate it as a site, it's not as evident, but we can start seeing ways of how families started to group together and to mobilize. So as a site and a form of action, certain family members took the steps to call newspaper offices and to find out more about what happened when they first heard about the bombings on June 23rd.
So for example, in his testimony, Dr. Gupta, who's in the room here and who spoke so eloquently yesterday, he stated, "On June 23rd, I was awakened at about 5:30 a.m. by a phone call from a very close friend. This friend died a week and a half back of a heart attack. His radio alarm went off early in the morning. He told me to listen to the radio. The news shattered our little world. My son and I went to our place of worship in our home to pray. Then I called newspaper offices. They confirmed that there were no survivors expected. In Toronto at daybreak, friends began coming as did members of the media. The government of Canada, for that matter, any government, did not set up any information line and did not offer to hear any administrative or emotional help immediately or any time thereafter. Instead, we heard that Prime Minister Brian Mulroney sent condolences to the Indian Prime Minister. Dr. Gupta speaks about how he first heard about the bombings and how his initial response was to contact members of the media to find out more details about what happened to Flight 182. He also identifies ways that families could have been supported. And here's that first moment where we need to start paying attention to the family's demands. This is by having a government contact, an information line, administrative or emotional support, and we can continue on. So Mr. Sushil Gupta, who's also in the room who spoke this morning, his testimony supplements his father's, and he references experience with the media at the time of the bombing as a source of information. He states, "What I do remember is my father getting very angry with whomever he called in the government, as that unknown individual indicated that they were not interested in assisting, that he should call Air India. He had to turn to the media for news and updates. At some point, my father asked me to contact my district manager with the newspaper I was a paperboy for, the Toronto Star, in the hopes that he could assist in finding someone who could keep our family up to date." So this demand for information and this demand then for different places where information can be accessed from begins to show forms of mobilization, forms of calling, forms of demanding for answers and information in a very unique way, which will link to some of the other sites that I'm talking about. Mr. Sushil Gupta's statement clearly recalls his father's need to mobilize to access for information, as I just said, which was also met, and this is also an important part here, with no support or very little assistance. So that pushback is also significant in this moment of claim making. In other words, or in another example, Ali Tahir Sadiq's written submission refers to his experience trying to get information then from the airline and the police immediately after the bombing. He states, "It was after 9 a.m. in the UK. The plane had already been bombed. Hearing the news, my sister was the first to find out about the bombing. Her colleague told her. My phone rang at 9 o'clock. My brother told me the news. Then he went to the Air India office. When I reached the Air India office, it was degrading to know that the staff of the office and the RCMP who were present in the Air India office had not yet phoned or contacted Ireland. 8 hours had passed. Radios were talking about the topic for hours. When we asked the authorities what did they know, they said, we were also just hearing the news from the radio. Instead of contacting Cork, the RCMP were trying to stop me, told me to go home and to be quiet. They had no information. In fact, they were even more unaware than the common people listening to the radio. We asked them to let us go to Ireland, but they refused for 3 days. 3 days felt like 3 years. We were hooked to the radio, no official giving us any news or support." So Mr. Ali Sadiq's testimony refers to the lack of communication to the families from government officials. It also indicates that he felt at the most basic level, because it progresses for the following 20-some years, that the RCMP had the responsibility of taking an active role in obtaining information for the families. Here's where you also then see a form of action and mobilization around what the RCMP and other government officials could have done to support the families. Site 2, for this case, I'm moving to Parliament Hill here, and I'm in a time period of 1988, 3 years after. So over the first few years, we see how families mobilized in several ways to ensure their calls for a public inquiry were heard. They contacted government officials at all levels immediately after the bombings up until the inquiry, making phone calls and sending letters to the constituency representatives as just a few of the many examples. For the first few years after the bombings, there were a series of multi-faith memorials held in major cities across Canada, and some initial condolences to families from government officials, mostly at the civic and provincial levels. As an example of a family member, of a friend of a family member, I turned to Mr. Rama Keshavan's testimony, and how he details one of the major steps the families took to organize a vigil on Parliament Hill in Ottawa in 1988. He states, "By the third anniversary in 1988, my conscience prodded me to try to assist the victims' families in organizing or simply attending the annual memorial at Dow's Lake in Ottawa. I managed to contact Dr. Yogesh Paliwal, who had lost his son in the tragedy and was the primary organizer for the victims' families in the Ottawa region. I spoke to Dr. Paliwal over the phone about my desire to help in the Air India Memorial activities. Our conversation struck a chord, and after several minutes of friendly chat, I got him interested in organizing a public demonstration at Parliament Hill in Ottawa calling for a public inquiry. I would soon learn that the victims' families were in a desperate state and on the verge of giving up their call for justice. The parliamentarians who had promised to raise the issues at the rights place had backed off. The RCMP would not talk to any of the victims' families, singly or as a group. Finally, they were running out of ideas to continue the struggle in the face of stonewalling by authorities." Thank you. The passage above draws attention to how families contacted each other to organize a demonstration, mobilizing individuals in different cities across Canada. In particular, with this testimony, we can see how that need to reach out to other family members was important. We can also see the need that learning about the victims, the need that the victims' families were also in a desperate state and on the verge of giving up their call for justice in terms of the lack of response or the understanding or acknowledgement of the demands that they were making for their rights. He calls out parliamentarians and members of RCMP for falsely promising family support, referring to the callous actions as stonewalling by authorities. So due to time, I won't be able to get to my third site, which is the differences between in opinions of what the inquiry will actually achieve by the family members. But just to end on a few points of what I'm trying to articulate here in terms of purpose, if we look at citizenship and how it's practiced, a theoretical and also a shift in practice could be to look at the activities, the political struggle, and the claims of recognition of different marginalized individuals. It's to then look at the different sites where the demands were made. So for me, the demand of discrimination and the demand for rights wanted to translate in some form of action. And so by looking at the activities, as we can see, there's these lists of different demands that could be then mobilized to have supported the family members. We can also then see how we understand rights in terms of the civil, the political, the social, the sexual, ecological, and cultural. We can look at sites that refer to bodies, courts, our streets, media, networks. And we can also look at scales in how this happens and where the impact is, from the home to an office, from the urban, the regional, the national, to the transnational. And then we can look at how these acts then impact the way we were responded to, whether it's voting or volunteering or protesting, resisting, or even giving testimony at a public inquiry. Thank you.